You, of course, have great insight into Pakistan, but you have great insight into a lot of other similar jurisdictions. So be it enforced disappearances in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or extrajudicial killings in many of the countries in South Asia or beyond, in Philippines with Duterte's drug war. And when we talk about, particularly in Pakistan, when we talk about these issues, sometimes, but as Mr. Gagyani was saying, that there are problems which, he gave the example of the United States, but there are problems which are common in terms of the challenges that governments face. And in your experience, I think it'll be very beneficial for everyone here to listen to your experience of what has worked and what hasn't in dealing with enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, and the wider set of rule of law. So I think that, if you could talk about that, that would be very valuable.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, and thank you really to the Asma Jahangir Foundation and AGHS, for organising these wonderful 2 days. And as someone who knew and worked alongside Asma, was mentored by Asma over many years, it's been wonderful to experience her spirit among everyone these sessions. Yes, the problems that we're talking about, this terrible toxic mix of enforced disappearance, torture as well, has really been a scourge in the South Asia region. Usually these types of cases occur, I think, in three broad patterns or contexts. Firstly, we often see them in the context of democracy struggles against a military or authoritarian regime. That certainly has been the experience of Pakistan in the past. It's very much what's happening in Myanmar today. Amongst the thousands of people arrested since the coup in February, there are hundreds of people who have been taken into unacknowledged detention, and their whereabouts are unknown. I think the second type of cases are the ones we've been discussing here, which come up very much in this context of conflict, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and this is very much the context we've seen here in Pakistan, particularly the cases you're talking about from 2015, 2016, but also in Indian-administered Kashmir. I think this is, again, where we see this type of disappearance. And the third type of case, it's a new type really, which we see emerging in some countries where these disappearances are linked much more to land issues, environment issues, sometimes drug enforcement issues, and where again, activists, journalists, and others have touched on powerful political or economic nerves, and this has been the form of reprisal by the state or by other powerful private actors. So I think we see a spread of these phenomena across the region, and in a way, many of them have been manifest here in Pakistan. When I look at the region, there have also been a number of efforts to investigate, bring redress, prevent enforced disappearances. And this is largely thanks really to the tireless campaign and efforts of the survivors and families of the disappeared, and I'd very much like to pay tribute to our panelists, but also to the some good judgments from higher courts, including here in Pakistan, efforts of tireless campaigners like Baba Saab. So there has been movement on these issues, and yet still these measures nowhere have really been sufficient or have really achieved the result. In Sri Lanka, for instance, where you had tens of thousands of enforced disappearances in the course of the conflict and insurgency over 3 decades, there have been several successive presidential commissions of inquiry that produced actually a vast amount of documentation and information on cases. And then in 2017, they created a dedicated Office of Missing Persons that was intended to follow up on all of this, and both in terms of investigation, but also reparation to the victims. And while it got off to a good start, with the change of government in Sri Lanka, it's also taken a backward step and is really, focusing only on the reparation aspect, and is really struggling to keep the confidence of the victims and their families. And the same happened in Nepal. Actually today is the 15th anniversary of the peace agreement in Nepal, which included a number of these mechanisms, including an Office of Missing Persons. And it's also really struggled with, independence and resources and the trust of the victims. So when we look at the Commission of Inquiry established here in Pakistan, 2011, I mean, it's a similar experience. It should serve an important purpose, but it has proved not to be fit for purpose. While it has managed to trace and track down, many hundreds or thousands of cases on paper, it hasn't led to any real accountability or any real reparation to victims. But I still think it's worth thinking about what role a dedicated commission or institution or mechanism can play in having a holistic approach to this issue, rather than just approaching only the issue on the level of individual cases, but looking at it in a collective way. Now, several countries have also gone through the process of criminalizing enforced disappearances. And this is really important, obviously, to prevent the recurrence of this violation. And we've been working with Thailand, with the Republic of Korea. Malaysia is now interested in a law of this kind. And of course, we've been following closely the passage of the enforced disappearances law that's been proposed in the parliament in Pakistan, and that many of you have been advocating for. But we are concerned that the latest draft, includes these clawback provisions, in particular one that really would put the onus on victims by making it punishable to bring false complaints of disappearance, which really turns the whole thing on its head. And when you have victims who already need great courage, actually, to bring cases forward, this will really even further raise the barriers to justice. So we really hope this draft can be improved and really brought in line with the international standard. But as Baba Saab, I think, said, I mean, a law to criminalize disappearances it's important, but it's not sufficient, because the law has to be accompanied, firstly, I think, by looking at all the other laws that create the enabling environment for this to happen. I think of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka, but here it might be this aid to the civil power regulation, that gives sweeping powers of detention to the security forces, intelligence services, and so you need to strip back these other laws, but also I think, as Baba Saab said, you need to tackle the question of security sector reform. What is the apparatus that has perpetrated this, and how to build in the civilian oversight and the checks and balances and the controls that are needed to prevent that happening again. Lastly, just one way to bring all of this together, of course, is to ratify the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances. And here in Pakistan, the Supreme Court has already held that the principles of the convention apply in Pakistan, under the right to life in the Constitution. But ratifying the convention would really cement that, in a long-term basis and legacy. We have about 5 countries in the region so far that have ratified the convention, including Sri Lanka, including Cambodia. Malaysia is considering at the moment. But it would be a very powerful signal, I think, if Pakistan could, join that, committed group of countries on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rory, the same question that I was largely asking Baba Saab, that we've talked about sort of enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, which are very acute manifestations of a broken criminal justice system. And to talk about, he's talked about judicial reform, but one area that we haven't had the opportunity to talk about so far is the prison reform. Because the idea that, there is, as I said, enforced disappearances, internment centers, those exist beyond the bound of the law. But what exists between, and for both Pakistan and for other countries that you work on or supervise work on in the region, in terms of prison reforms, a conversation or any insight into what needs to be done and what has worked so far? Because in Pakistan, it's not only the internment centers. That, of course, as I said, is the acute manifestation of what's wrong. But what's wrong is the rot is deep, and the rot is in Camp Jail Lahore or Central Jail Karachi. And again, my question would be the last question I asked: what has worked and what hasn't, and in other jurisdictions, and for the specific circumstances of Pakistan, if you can draw some lessons or recommendations, perhaps.
Have been mentioned by other panelists. I think on one level, this extreme of enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killing has its own specificity. And of course, in the context of the counterterrorism and other measures, it has its own dynamics. But in some ways, it is also a function of this broken criminal justice system, because when the system is broken, the incentive is there for the law enforcement, security forces to take summary extrajudicial action. And we certainly see this in the context of drug enforcement in a country like the Philippines, for instance, where there have been thousands of alleged extrajudicial killings of minor drug suspects who have been gunned down, effectively in a kind of cleanup operation. Now, Baba Saab has talked about reforms at the judicial level. I think when it comes to the broader law enforcement prison issues, the first is what are we putting people in prison for, and how do we approach this in terms of alternatives to detention? For a lot of offences, the reason the jails are so overcrowded is because there are many people in jail, firstly, who are in pre-trial detention, haven't yet even been brought before the court or reached the trial stage. As many as 60-70% quite often in pre-trial detention. So through the use of bail, through the use of early release and clemency and other powers, how do you bring down that caseload and pressure that is really breaking the system? And I think this is the first point: alternatives to detention, reducing this over-reliance on pre-trial detention, and secondly, perhaps looking at the nature of offences and sentences. And there are many people serving sentences or under trial for offences that for which imprisonment is actually not the appropriate sanction or rehabilitation. Minor drug offences, possession of drugs for personal use, and so forth. Again, a category of people who could be handled with alternatives to detention. So I think reducing pretrial detention, exploring alternatives to detention, these are very important reforms that would reduce that overall burden on the system. A lot of this has come up in the context of COVID, because of COVID, very dangerous in the prison system. And so last year we saw a number of countries, including Pakistan, begin to release some categories of prisoners to decongest the jails to prevent the spread of COVID. So this was very welcome. But how can we somehow institutionalize that moment, or capture that moment for a longer term institutional policy reform that not just about COVID, but can really put the system onto a better footing?